The man at table 9 had been speaking German for the past 4 minutes, and he didn't know that the woman refilling his water glass understood every word. Wendell Ostroff didn't lower his voice. That was the thing. He didn't even bother. He sat across from his business associate, a younger man named Felix, who kept glancing toward the server like he wasn't entirely comfortable with what was happening, and Wendell just kept talking. Loud enough for her to hear. Loud enough, maybe, that he wanted her to hear, or rather, wanted her to stand there and not understand, which to a man like Wendell was the same as being invisible. Sie sieht aus wie jemand, der nicht mal die Speisekarte lesen kann, Wendell said. She looks like someone who can't even read the menu. Felix said nothing. He looked at his bread plate. The woman with the water carafe set it down on the edge of the table, smoothed her apron once, and walked back toward the kitchen without a word. Her name was Coretta Marsh. She had worked the floor at Aldgate, one of the 12 finest restaurants in Chicago, for going on 6 years. She was 51 years old. She had raised 2 children in a 2-bedroom apartment on the South Side, buried her mother, put herself through night school while working double shifts, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, somewhere between the grief and the grocery bills, and the alarm going off at 5 in the morning, she had taught herself German, not because anyone asked her to, not because it would get her a promotion or a raise or even a thank you. She had done it because her grandmother used to say that a mind fed is a mind free. And Coretta Marsh had taken that seriously her entire life. But Wendell Ostroff didn't know any of that. He just saw the uniform. If you've ever been looked through like you weren't there, you already know what this story is about. And if you haven't, stay with me, because you're going to want to see how this ends. Aldgate sat on the 44th floor of a building in the West Loop, the kind of place where the lighting was warm amber, and the menus had no prices on the guest copy. Not because the restaurant was trying to be mysterious, because if you were asking, you probably shouldn't be there. That was the unspoken rule, and everyone who ate there knew it, and everyone who worked there knew it too. And the staff navigated that tension with a particular kind of grace that doesn't get talked about enough. Coretta had been doing it for 6 years. She knew which tables liked to linger, and which wanted to be turned quickly. She knew the sommelier's name was Philip Grau, and that he would always defer to her if a guest at her table was being difficult about a wine pairing, because she had saved him from a bad situation once involving a Wall Street type and a 2011 Barolo that the kitchen had accidentally opened too early. She knew that the head chef, a woman named Rosalind, kept a small jar of lemon heads in her jacket pocket and would slip one to whichever server looked like they needed it most around 9 o'clock on a Friday. Coretta usually got one. She knew the restaurant. She knew the work. She was, by any honest measure, exceptional at her job. She was also, by any honest measure, not the kind of person Wendell Ostroff thought he was dealing with. Wendell was in town from Munich for a 4-day acquisition meeting. His firm, Ostroff Capital, which specialized in distressed asset acquisitions in the European and American mid-market, had a reputation for being aggressive and effective, and Wendell himself had a reputation for being the more difficult version of both of those things. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, with the particular self-assurance of a man who had never once been told that his behavior was a problem rather than a personality. He had requested table 9, specifically because it had the best view of the skyline and the most distance from neighboring tables. He had sent back the bread twice. He had called Coretta Miss, the way some people use the word to mean something else entirely. Clipped, dismissive. The same tone you'd use to shoo a cat. Felix, whose last name was Bauer, and who worked for Ostroff Capital's Chicago liaison office, had spent most of the evening apologizing with his eyes to whoever Wendell had just been rude to. It wasn't enough, but at least he knew it wasn't enough, which put him ahead of his boss. The German started around the 3rd course. Diese Leute arbeiten hier ihr ganzes Leben. Und was haben sie am Ende? Wendell said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the room. These people work here their whole lives, and what do they have at the end? Felix said quietly. Wendell, ich meine, schau sie dir an. I mean, look at her. Sie bringt uns Wasser. Das ist ihr Leben. She brings us water. That is her life. Coretta was at the table. She was not looking at him. She was pouring. And here is the thing about Coretta Marsh that Wendell Ostroff did not understand and could not have guessed. She had learned German specifically through literature. She had started with Kafka because someone at her book club had mentioned the Metamorphosis offhand, and she'd gone looking for the original text, curious whether something got lost in translation. It had. Enough that she kept going. Goethe next. Then Brecht. Then a period drama series she'd found online at 2 in the morning, after a long shift, which was where she'd picked up the cadence of how people actually spoke. The informal contractions, the regional inflection. She'd been at it for 9 years. She read German novels on her lunch break. She was, in the estimation of the one German professor she'd ever spoken to, a man she'd met at a library event on the North Side 3 years ago, completely fluent. She poured the water. She set the carafe down. She said, in German, clearly and without any particular rush, Die Welt ist größer, als Sie denken, Herr Ostroff. The world is larger than you think, Mr. Ostroff. And then she asked, in English, in the same tone she used for every table, whether they would like to hear about the evening's dessert offerings. The silence at table 9 lasted approximately 4 seconds. Felix looked at the tablecloth. Wendell Ostroff looked at Coretta Marsh for what was possibly the first time all evening. Not through her. She looked back. She was not smiling. She was not angry. She was simply there, present, unhurried, waiting. I'll give you a few minutes, she said, and walked away. If this story is already making you feel something, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed to Lineage Tales yet, this is the moment. We tell stories about people who carry more than the world can see. You're going to want to be here for all of them. What happened in the next 20 minutes at table 9 was, by Felix Bauer's account later, one of the quieter implosions he had ever witnessed. Wendell didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He went still in the way that certain kinds of men go still when they've been caught. Not remorseful, not embarrassed in any clean or correctable way, but recalibrating. Figuring out if there was a version of what just happened that he could reframe to his advantage. There wasn't. Felix had worked for Wendell for 6 years. He knew the difference between his boss processing something and his boss plotting something, and for the first time in recent memory, what he was watching was the former. Wendell was simply sitting with it. He asked for the check before dessert, which was unusual. Coretta brought it. She did not make anything of the interaction. She thanked them both for coming in, as she thanked every table, and she meant it in the exact same way she always meant it. Professionally, warmly, without performance. If she felt any particular satisfaction in the moment, she kept it in the same place she kept most things. Inside, where it belonged to her. But the evening wasn't over. What Coretta didn't know, and wouldn't know until the next morning, was that the table adjacent to 9, close enough to hear, angled just right, had been occupied by a woman named Sylvia Drummond, who was a restaurant critic for a magazine that no serious Chicago food person would pretend they didn't read. Sylvia had been there reviewing the fall menu. She had heard everything. She had written nothing down in the moment, because she hadn't needed to. Some things don't require notes. And 2 seats away from Sylvia had been a man named Carter Webb, who ran the Chicago office of an international hospitality group that Coretta had applied to 3 years ago and been passed over for. Not because she wasn't qualified, as she had later come to understand, but because the person doing the hiring at the time had made a different kind of decision. The kind that doesn't get said out loud. Carter had been at Aldgate that evening for a dinner with his wife. He had also heard everything. The world is larger than you think. Coretta found out about Sylvia Drummond's piece the way most people find things out now. Her daughter texted her a link at 7:15 in the morning while she was drinking her first cup of coffee. The piece wasn't about the restaurant. Well, it mentioned the restaurant, and positively, which Rosalind was pleased about when Coretta showed her. But the heart of it was something else. Sylvia hadn't used Wendell's name. She hadn't needed to. She had written about the moment, the way good writers write about a particular kind of moment. Not by describing it, but by letting it mean what it meant. She wrote about the assumption of invisibility, about the labor of dignity in spaces not designed to notice it, about a server who had responded to contempt not with anger and not with silence, but with something rarer and more permanent. Accuracy. A simple statement of fact. The world is larger than you think. She had called it, in the piece, a kind of grace under conditions most people never have to navigate. Coretta read it twice. Then she put her phone down and finished her coffee. She had grown up in Roseland, on the far south side, in a household where grace was not a performance but a practice. Her mother had worked as a home health aide for 30 years. Her father had driven a city bus. They had not been wealthy. They had not had connections or networks or people who called in favors on their behalf. What they had given Coretta was something harder to quantify and harder to take away. The understanding that who you were in a moment was the only thing that was entirely yours. Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, everyone called her, a woman who had grown up in rural Georgia and made it to Chicago at 19 with $40 and a list of addresses, had told Coretta something once that she had turned over in her mind many times since. Mama Ruth had said, "The ones who look past you are just showing you their limits. Don't you pick them up and carry them." Coretta had thought about that a lot over 6 years of Aldgate. She thought about it again that morning, reading Sylvia Drummond's piece. She didn't think about Wendell Ostroff much at all. Carter Webb called the restaurant the next afternoon and asked for her by name. Rosalind came back to find Coretta on her break in the small room off the kitchen where the staff kept their things and said simply, "There's a call for you. Man says it's professional, not personal, and that he'll be brief if you want him to be." She paused. He was polite about it. Coretta took the call. Carter introduced himself and his company, Meridian Hospitality Group, and then he did something that she hadn't expected. He apologized. Not for what Wendell had done. That wasn't his to apologize for. He apologized for the hiring decision 3 years ago. He said he had looked up her application after seeing the piece, and he said, plainly, that the pass had been wrong. He didn't dress it up. He said wrong. Coretta was quiet for a moment. She said, "What is it you're calling about, Mr. Webb?" He told her. Meridian was opening a flagship property in the West Loop the following year, a hotel and restaurant concept, the kind of thing that came around once in a decade. They were building a senior staff roster from scratch. He was specifically looking for a front-of-house director, someone who could train staff, set culture, be the living embodiment of the standard they were trying to establish. He said he had watched her at table 9 for the better part of 2 hours before the moment everyone was now talking about. And he said, "The way you work a room, Ms. Marsh, it's not something you teach. It's something you find. And I've been looking for it for a long time." She asked for a week to think about it. He said take 2. She took 10 days because she does things on her own timeline. What happened with Wendell Ostroff is a different kind of ending. And it's worth saying, because these stories sometimes skip over it and they shouldn't. Felix Bauer wrote an internal memo 2 days after the dinner. He addressed it to the board of Ostroff Capital's European parent company, which had for some time been quietly receiving complaints about Wendell's conduct in meetings, in negotiations, in restaurants. The memo described what had happened at Aldgate in plain language. It was not dramatic. It was thorough. 3 weeks later, Wendell Ostroff accepted what was described publicly as early retirement. The board, according to someone who would know, had been looking for a reason. Felix had finally given them the documentation they needed, and the trigger had been, of all things, an overheard dinner conversation in a restaurant on the 44th floor of a building in the West Loop, where a woman in an apron had said 8 words in German and meant every one of them. Coretta found this out eventually, from Sylvia Drummond, who had kept following the thread because that's what good journalists do. Sylvia told her over coffee, at a place in Wicker Park that Coretta liked. Coretta nodded. She stirred her cup. She said, "Good. Just that. Good. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just settled, like a fact that had been verified and could now be filed away." She accepted Carter Webb's offer on a Tuesday morning. She called Rosalind first to tell her, which Rosalind later told people was the most Coretta thing Coretta had ever done. Not because it was required, but because Coretta thought it was right to tell the people who had stood by her before she told anyone else. Rosalind cried a little, which surprised them both. She said she'd known for years that Coretta was working below what she was capable of, and that she was ashamed it had taken a stranger's cruelty to move things in the direction they should have moved on their own. Coretta told her not to be ashamed. She said, "You ran a good room, Rosalind." That's not nothing. It wasn't. Before she left Aldgate, she did two things. She left a handwritten note for the junior servers, the young women and men who were 6 months in, learning the floor, figuring out what kind of professional they were going to be. The note said, in part, "The person who underestimates you is giving you information. Don't react to it. Receive it, then go do the work." And she tracked down Philip Grau, the sommelier who had covered for her once with the Barolo situation 3 years ago, and she put in a word with Carter Webb's hiring team. Philip was offered a position at Meridian 6 weeks later. He accepted. That's who Coretta Marsh is. A lot of people, when they heard this story, focused on the German, on the moment, on Wendell's face, or what they imagined his face to be. And it was a moment. It was earned, and it was real, and nobody's going to tell you it wasn't satisfying, because it was. But that's not the part of this story that stays with you, or it shouldn't be. The part that stays is this. Coretta Marsh did not learn German to have a moment. She learned it because Kafka made more sense in the original. She learned it because her grandmother told her to feed her mind. She learned it at 2 in the morning after double shifts, on a phone with a cracked screen, in an apartment on the South Side, with no guarantee that it would ever matter to anyone but her. She built a life that was larger than what anyone looking at her could see. And when someone looked through her and spoke as though she wasn't there, she didn't get small. She didn't get loud. She just said 8 words and let the silence after them do the rest. The world is larger than you think, Mr. Ostroff. It always was. If Coretta's story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us about someone in your life who carried more than the world gave them credit for. Those stories matter. They belong here. Subscribe to Lineage Tales. We'll be here, and so will they.